So Dick, can you tell us what parts are within the IFS system?
Parts turn out to be little personalities inside, full range personalities. So if, for example, you got angry and I asked you to focus on your anger, and I'd ask you where you find it in your body, around your body, which you could locate, maybe it's in your chest. And then I asked you how you felt toward it to the point where you got curious about it and you asked some questions. You would learn, if you waited for the answer and not think of what it was saying, that it's much more than just a bundle of anger, that it has some fear maybe, that it has desires for you, that it's trying to protect other parts of you. It would have a lot to tell you about itself. So, and I just stumbled onto that discovery when I was very young, maybe 32, and my clients started talking about these parts. And I got scared at first because multiplicity has been pathologized in our culture. And after I got over that, I got intrigued and did find that as they started to talk to them, these parts have a lot to tell us. They're not just single emotions. They're not just a voice that's saying the same thing over and over. They actually have a strong desire to help us. And there aren't any bad ones, it turns out.
And can you say the difference between a part and maybe just a voice in my head? So if I have a voice that says, shoot, you forgot the milk today,
Right.
or don't forget this, is there any way for me to help identify if that thought is a part, or if every voice in my head is some expression of a part?
Every voice in your head is an expression of a part, and the voice is just one manifestation of it. For other people it might be a thought, other people it might be an emotion, or a sensation even. But if you start with the voice and you just focus on it and ask it some questions, it'll tell you things you didn't know often. And it'll tell you about itself and why it's in there and how it struggled to try and keep up with all the things you have to remember and how much it's tired, wants to rest. And, I don't expect people to believe this because I'm saying it's true. I wouldn't have believed it if I was watching this video and somebody was talking about it. So maybe later we can actually help people with an experience of it, a taste of it. But that's what I discovered, and because I'm trained as a family therapist, I had stayed away from any understanding of the intrapsychic process. So when I had clients start to talk about these things, I didn't have any presumptions, and I was forced to actually listen to what they were saying about themselves. So the model is pretty experience-friendly that way. Most people, once they get past the, oh my God, am I a multiple, they start to actually, yeah, that sounds right to me.
Can you say what self is within the IFS model?
Yeah, so self is now become the centerpiece of the model, and I just stumbled onto that. There are a lot of models that talk about subpersonalities actually, but because of my family therapy background, when I would try to have dialogues between my client and these parts, I started to notice that other parts would interfere, and as I got them to separate, because when you're working with a family, you want to have just two people talk to each other, and if a third starts to interfere, you ask them to step out. So I thought maybe the same operation in this family, and I would ask them to get these other parts, these interfering ones, to give us some space. And when I would do that, it was like a new person would pop out of nowhere and would be calm and confident and would be curious about the part that they were talking to, and the part would sort of disarm and would be much more willing to talk about itself and to be vulnerable, actually. And when I would ask people about who is that, they would say, I'd say, what part is that? They'd say, that's not a part like these others, that's me, that's myself. So we came to call that the capital S, self, to distinguish it from the common usage of the word self, which means the whole person. And as I tried it with other clients, it was like the same person would pop out. And always undamaged kind of essence that, in addition to being curious, confident, and calm, often would have compassion just immediately for the part they were working with, for the person they were talking to, would have a lot of courage. So we have what we call the 8 C words that characterize self. Courage, creativity, clarity. So the part would change its image and see it much more for what it is, actually. And connectedness. There's a kind of innate desire in self to connect to self, in parts, in people, and a sense of being much more connected than isolated. So that was remarkable when I started to see that in a couple clients, and I thought, wow, they must have had really good parenting, because how else could they have this kind of ego strength? And I would comb their histories to find the person that they got it from, because I was trained in attachment theory, to believe that to have any of that, you had to have gotten it from another person, from an outside relationship. And many of these clients there was no person in their life they possibly could have gotten that from. So I really started to have to shift at some point to believe that this is just inherent in us, that it's sort of our birthright, and that in addition to those qualities, there's a kind of wisdom about how to heal internally and externally. So self-heals is a bumper sticker someday I'm going to print, because it's really true. So often as we help clients access that state and then begin to relate to these parts, they sort of take over the session, and I just get out of the way, because they really do know how to heal themselves. And that's a tough sell. Both the idea that we're multiple and the idea that this is in there undamaged and knows how to heal isn't syntonic with our culture at all. So it's been a kind of uphill battle to convince people.
Okay. And what does healing look like within the IFS?
Okay, that's another good question. So parts, as I say, come with us into the world, either dormant or manifest, and so, but they are forced out of their naturally valuable states by traumas and attachment injuries, and they take on extreme beliefs and emotions from those experiences that they kind of take to heart. So healing, one way to describe healing is the release of these burdens, these extreme beliefs and emotions, like I'm worthless, or the world is really dangerous, or I need to lash out at somebody, or I need to withdraw all the time. The release of those, which then, almost like a curse is lifted, the parts immediately transform into their naturally valuable states. So that at one level is healing. Another level is what we call restoring the part's trust in the leadership of self, because often when bad things happen to us, the parts feel like they have to protect the self, and they have to stand in front of the bullet and take it, and then they lose trust in self-leadership, and they thereafter become like parentified children in a family. In fact, all these parts, that's why I call it internal family systems. It's sort of like in families, especially where there's been trauma, kids get forced into kind of rigid roles. And there are different schools of therapy have different names for those roles. And then good family therapists can come in and make things safe for them to step out of those roles into who they naturally are. For me, that's the same as these parts. They're really stuck in these roles by these burdens, by the belief they have to protect the system, by the fact the system is now much more vulnerable, and by the other fact that many of them are frozen in the scene in which they got burdened. So they're frozen in time in these different trauma scenes. So as I explored, it became clear that the idea that people can just change these things that are causing their symptoms, causing them to act out, causing them to explode in rage or to withdraw all the time, or by willpower, is it just creates a lot of polarization inside of people. Either they succeed, in which case they're sitting on all this stuff and they feel delicate because it could explode all the time, or they don't succeed and they feel totally like failures because they should be able to. Everyone says, why can't you stop? So it turns out these parts generally can't change until what they protect have been healed and the system isn't so vulnerable, and until they've unloaded these extreme beliefs and emotions they've been carrying.
Mm-hmm. And what does the process of unloading look like?
Okay, so when I was exploring all this, and we would run into this, parts would actually say, I carry this fireball in my gut and it's driving me to do these things, or this weight on my shoulders. We started having them just take it off and see how it feels. And they'd feel better, but it would be back the next session. So over time, I learned that, first of all, they need to feel like the self, not the therapist, but the self needs to really get what happened when they picked up these burdens in the past. So you become a compassionate witness to your own history. Not only the video of the history, but also the emotions the part felt or the sensations. And different parts need different things to feel witnessed. But if you can do that to the point where the part says, now I feel like you finally get it, then that's a huge relief to most of these parts. And they're still frozen in time. So another step is to have you, the self, go into the scene and take the part to a safe place, at which point they're usually ready to let go of these emotions and beliefs they've been carrying sometimes 30, 40 years, and they, like a curse is lifted, will transform. So that's what it seems to take. This is, again, through years of trial and error. And it all sounds kind of new woo-woo, kind of new agey at first, but it actually does work.
What would you say is the heart or the core tenet of IFS that kind of fuels everything? If I was to know one thing about it, and only one thing, what would that be?
I would say that we aren't who we think we are, because we tend to identify with these parts and their burdens, and down deep inside believe, basically, I'm really not very valuable, or I'm really dangerous, or whatever the part is. That's often becomes our identity. And actually what most spiritual traditions call enlightenment is simply that shift in identity, shift in your center of inner gravity from these parts and their beliefs to knowing that this self I've been describing is who you really are. And that is quite liberating. And in addition to knowing that that's who you are, that self can lead both internally and externally in a much better way than these parts can, and will create harmony at both levels. So I guess to answer the question, that's what I would say.
And how does IFS differ from some of the other forms of therapy that people might be introduced to? How does IFS maybe differ or take a different approach to the internal system?
Yeah, well, most other forms of therapy are based on this mono-mind idea that we just have one mind, which I believe is a myth. And when you think of it that way, then there's only a limited range you have for having people relate to their emotions and their thoughts and their urges and their impulses and all of that. Because if that's the way you think of them, as random impulses, then you're going to try to control them. You're going to try, if you think of it as irrational thought, you're going to try and correct that. If you think of it as an out-of-control impulse, you're going to try and just use your willpower to control it. And I did that in the beginning, finding that it just made them more extreme. And it isn't until you actually consider their personhood that you'll have compassion for them, and you'll relate to them in a different way, the way you would to a suffering being in the outside. I had a conversation once with the Dalai Lama, and my big line was, you ask people to go with your external enemies with compassion. Why don't you do that with your internal enemies? Because he talks about there are these afflictive emotions that we have to control and so on. So,
greed and anger. And
yeah, those things. So it turns out that greed and anger are just parts that are trying their best. And they need compassion, and the more you attack them, or the more you ignore them, the stronger they get, and the more they try to take over. So most therapies are based on that. There are a few that actually take this multiplicity seriously and find pretty similar results, or at least similar view of what these parts are as you kind of get to know them. But the way I judge a therapeutic system is how it teaches you to relate to these, to your thoughts and emotions, which are coming out of these different parts. And not that many have a real compassionate take on it. Mindfulness has been a big step forward in my mind, because rather than what we were talking about, judging them or stifling them, or you just separate and you observe them and you kind of accept them. So IFS could be seen as a next step. So separating, noticing them is great, because that is a way to access self. And people do feel some of these C-word qualities I've been talking about when they are practicing mindfulness. But it isn't necessarily compassionate to watch suffering beings parade by, just passively observing them. So people generally have an impulse to actually go to them and want to hold them and hug them and care for them. And so that's what we do. So that's the next step, is to actually begin interacting with them like a good leader, a good parent, getting to know them, honoring them for their service, learning about what they protect, negotiating permission to go to what they protect. All of that from a kind of mindful place. And so mindfulness practice is very complementary.